You are listening to Impact Hustlers, and I am your host, Maiko. I have made it my mission to inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs to solve some of the world's biggest social and environmental problems. And for this reason, I am speaking to some of the best entrepreneurs out there who are solving problems such as food waste, climate change, poverty, and homelessness. My goal is that Impact Hustlers will inspire you either by starting an impact business yourself, by joining the team of one, or by taking a small step, whatever that may be, towards being part of the solution to the world's biggest problems. All right, let's get started. So I'm really excited to have you on Impact Hustlers, Tom. Thanks very much for joining me today.
No worries, thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you. So I want to start by focusing a little bit on yourself and your entrepreneurial journey. We'll get into the details of Time to Spare in a minute. But you actually started your career as a consultant for Oliver Wyman. And I think you actually studied economics at Cambridge and had that background and then went into the consultancy world. What brought you from that world into entrepreneurship and actually starting your own company?
Well, I think when I was at Oliver Wyman, I tended to lean towards the more sort of technical, quantitative stuff that the organisation did. So I was doing some sort of like SQL analysis on big payments data sets. I was doing some sort of like credit risk analysis of big loan books and things like that. It wasn't sort of your traditional making PowerPoint slides look pretty. There's some pretty like big data sets that I was looking through with that. So that was kind of like my introduction into the more technical side of work and just learning some of those like quantitative coding skills. And I think I enjoyed that, but I wanted just a bit more ability to sort of take some of those further, to sort of take a project and keep going with it rather than having to sort of finish when the assignment finished essentially. So I wanted to set up a business. I've always sort of, I did like young enterprises as a kid at school. I always thought the idea was quite fun. And so just decided that when I left Oliver Wyman, I left without a plan really. And I just decided that I was going to start my own thing afterwards, as a bit of a gap and mostly to sort of make sure that my parents didn't completely freak out. When I quit, I moved to China, to Beijing for 6 months, as like a little bit of a sort of sabbatical in the middle, and basically just spent that time like learning Chinese at university out there, but also trying to teach myself how to code in the afternoons and evenings, which was like vaguely successful. I definitely came back not very good, but able to sort of set up my own website and go from there, basically.
All right. Do you think learning to code was instrumental to you launching the business, or was that not too relevant for that? Was it just a challenge for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. So what we do at Time to Spare is, we work with charities and government who are sort of notoriously slow to pick up new things. And I think if I had sort of contracted out all of the coding and the development from the very start, I would have run out of whatever money I had left very, very quickly, just in waiting for people to sort of get back to me and sign up. So I think, it was definitely really, really important in terms of being able to try things quickly and cheaply, because it's just my rent really that was the main cost at the start.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about it. You left Oliver Wyman without a real plan. You did learn Chinese. I think you actually spent some time in China for doing that, right? Then how did the idea come about? How did you actually start to focus? There's a problem to be solved between charities and government. And we'll talk about the problem in a second, but let's just focus. How did you first discover it?
So before I was doing this, I was working on a project called Who's In? And the idea was essentially to make it easier for people to volunteer to support projects or charities in their area, just sort of to lower that barrier, really. So I was working on that for a few months. There wasn't a huge amount of interest in it from charities. There was a little bit of interest from people who wanted to volunteer, but it wasn't taking off massively. And so I sort of sat down with a few of the charities that we had been working with and asked them, clearly this isn't exactly what works for you, but I'd be intrigued to know, is there anything that I could do that would be more useful, that would support something more sort of crucial and core to the work that they do every day. And it kind of surprised me that a lot of them came back with very similar feedback. So a lot of them were saying that recruiting new volunteers is sometimes difficult, but it's far harder to sort of manage existing projects, managing existing volunteers, collecting information about what's going on, and just sort of this standard sort of kind of thing that you might see in like a CRM in a business. Just those are the real challenges that charities faced. So I sort of found that really interesting. And I started to get slightly interested in the idea that there wasn't much information or data available on what charities were doing, who they were working with, and sort of what activities they were organising. You can go onto sort of the Charity Commission database, and there's information about every registered charity, but it's pretty limited. There's some short bits of information about their accounts, but not really much about what they actually do. But so I was like, this is kind of interesting. I can't for the life of me work out how anyone would ever, how a business would be sustainable off the back of this idea. Until I met someone who was the CEO of a CVS. So I don't know if you know what they are, but essentially a CVS is it's a council for voluntary services. And so a lot of different areas have these organisations, and they sort of sit as these sort of umbrella bodies for the local charities in an area. And she basically talked to me for 2 hours on this lovely terrace in North London, just going through all of the different parts of government that would find all of that information really valuable if it was actually possible to collect it. And this was kind of just me frantically writing notes because I thought it was just really interesting. And that conversation has essentially been the business for the 2 years after that.
Let's move to actually explaining everybody that's listening to us what the business actually does. So, but summarizing, you really went from a journey of, leaving your job behind, kind of looking at your passion of getting more people to volunteer, and then almost stumbling across a problem that the charities had, and then finding, okay, local governments also find this valuable. So you suddenly have these two actors, local governments and charities, that have some shared problem that you're like, okay, I could set up a company around this and helping them sort this out. So what is it actually that Time to Spare does now, and how do you kind of solve their problems of both sides of the coin, governments and charities?
Yeah, so what we do is, for charities, we have a piece of software that we call sort of like a community activity management system, which means they use it to record information about all the work they're doing and all the people they're working with. And then what we offer to governments is the ability to see sort of summary information about what those charities are doing and sort of who they're working with, so that they can make better decisions around organisations to fund and sort of interventions or projects that they can run in their local area.
And give us a bit of an idea on governments funding charities, right? I think for most people, it seems like charities are funded by our donations, and that seems to be the biggest factor. But when you first emailed me, actually, you told me governments are putting, in the UK at least, much more funding into charities than the private individuals. So give us some context on that. How much is actually government putting into these charities, and why are they doing it? Is it just because they're donating some money, or how are they actually collaborating with these charities?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's definitely a lot larger sum than most people are aware of. So each year, the UK government gives £16 billion to charities across the country. And I think individual donations are something like £9 billion each year. So actually, the government is sort of the largest single source of income to the charity sector, depending on how you split things up. Which is pretty interesting because it's not hugely transparent, and there's not much focus on where that money is coming from or going to. The reason why they do that is sort of split in a couple of parts. So some of that money is given as grants, so that might just be the local government wants to support the charities in their area because they're good for the local community to have a strong community centre or a strong like youth sports team. And others might be sort of like contracts. So people might have heard of the sort of like social care crisis and things like that, where it's very expensive for local authorities to provide social care to older adults, and often the way that they might choose to do that is they'll contract a charity, either a big national charity or a charity local to that area, and instead of doing that in-house, they'll sort of outsource that to the charity to do that for them.
Okay, got it. And then how are those governments and charities collaborating in a world where time to spare doesn't exist? And then maybe compare that with the charities and governments you're working with and how they've been able to bring that to another level.
Yeah, I think the best example of that is sort of during the pandemic and with the supporting people who are self-isolating. So, when the pandemic hit and a lot of people who are like older people or people who sort of like with compromised immune systems were told that they had to self-isolate or shield for a number of weeks. They were kind of like isolated to their homes. They weren't able to go shopping or doing sort of prescription pickups from the GP. They were told not to leave their house. And so what happened was a lot of local governments across the country were basically given the responsibility to support those groups of people. So they might have been given like a huge list of people who were self-isolating, and then what often they did in the sort of first wave of the pandemic was basically just deliver a food parcel to everyone on that list with the address that they got. And that was kind of pretty much it. I mean, that was a pretty big logistical arrangement to do that. But what happened was a lot of people didn't need the support because they'd managed to book a supermarket delivery, or they didn't need the support because their younger relative had dropped food around. And then there were some people who got the support, but really they needed a lot more. So they needed some sort of like mental health support, or they needed to, they might have lost their job because they had to self-isolate, which then meant they actually now need some support getting benefits they're entitled to. And that process of just like mass delivering to everyone didn't really account for that sort of individual variation in what people needed. So what we did in Camden, which is where we worked really closely with the local government there and the charities in the area, was we basically set up a system where people could get referred from. They could call up the council and say, I need help because I'm self-isolating, and they could be sent to a local charity, like a local food bank or a local community centre that was offering food, who would then either ask them to collect food if they could, send a relative, or deliver it to their house. But then the benefit of that way around was that person could also then talk to that charity that's supporting them and get extra support from sort of the Citizens Advice Bureau nearby, or from all of the other programs that these community centres ran. And the local government could see sort of, got data at each stage of the process, so they could see this person was being sent for referral. Where did they go to? Was that referral accepted? Could that organisation support or not support that person, and what extra needs did that person have? They could sort of see all of that in one place, which meant that they could plan a bit better how to deal with the situation. There's a really interesting bit in Camden where the congestion charge played havoc with volunteer drivers because they couldn't easily claim back expenses for delivering food to an area within the congestion charge zone. And because of Camden using time to spare, they could see that area of Camden had a clear gap in delivery coverage. So they brought in some sort of like bike deliveries instead of car deliveries, because that sort of got around the congestion charge problem. But I don't know how easy it would have been to see that otherwise.
So you're solving like a data transparency problem as well, and kind of connecting different interfaces of information as well, right? Where, the government has certain information, but also lacks insights in certain things. For example, it's citizens that need certain help, but that information doesn't get actually connected to the government, and then you connect that information back to the charities and what are they actually doing and how are they actually delivering. That seems quite a complex problem to solve in terms of collecting that data, making it visible, and also connecting the different actors to each other. It almost seems like the charities would all need to be using your platform, the government needs to use it, maybe the individual citizens need to use it. which seems quite a big challenge. So how does it work in practice to deliver this value?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a big challenge. I think in practice, what happens is charities can sort of use parts of the platform or all of the platform. It's kind of up to them. So, some of the charities we have use it for almost everything that they do within the organisation. So everything from like managing a youth club to accepting referrals to a food bank. Other charities might just use it for one or two things. So they might use it just for accepting referrals for people who need food, who are self-isolating, or they might just use it for like requesting volunteers from a central pool of volunteers, which is like a much lower touch way of using it. I think it does vary. And then on the government side, because our main focus is on getting it useful and used by the charities, the government tends to be slightly more of like a consumer of the information rather than needing to like completely overhaul all their internal systems. So it's slightly less effort for those people, I suppose.
All right. That's very interesting. And then outside of the pandemic, what are other potential use cases where this can be used at scale, if like, let's say, day-to-day local government councils of tasks that they need to complete that you're helping them with?
Yeah, I think it's basically anything which the local government wants to sort of outsource into the community. So I think, people tend to really not talk to the council unless there's something seriously wrong. So, you go to the council when you're in crisis. You don't go to the council when you want to join the local board games evening. Like that doesn't really match up. But actually, like those things are really beneficial to people in terms of preventing them from ending up in that crisis position. So, if there's local community centres that you can go to and meet people, then people aren't as lonely and they're more connected, and they're sort of like first response to any of the sort of developing issues. So actually, I think it can be pretty broad in terms of the way it applies. Because it could be anything that supports a community activity by any charity in the area. And so a lot of the work we've done up in the past couple of years has been just making it as flexible as possible so that it can cover all of those different potential use cases, basically.
Got it. And basically you have a referral product as well where local governments then can actually help their citizens as they come to them to the right charities and then keep track of the progress. Is that right?
Yeah, so it can be really difficult to find out information about what local charities are doing, just because there's no good central source of that. You can Google around for things, but you have to dive into the 10th or 11th page to find all of the information. And even for people within the charity sector or within local government, they don't know. So it's kind of hard for a local resident to know these things. What we do is try and pull all of that information together and get people accepting referrals through the same platform, the same sort of format and pieces of information. So that could be things like it could be food, like I said earlier, or it could be sort of like for legal advice cases. So if someone needs support with accessing benefits, or if someone has a dispute with their landlord that they need help with but just don't know where to go, there's always the local Citizens Advice Bureau, but they might not always be the best location for that sort of request for support. So we just basically have like a little matching algorithm that matches a referral to the best suited local organisation.
Got it. So one thing I'd like to focus on in the next few minutes is some of the lessons you've learned throughout your journey, and obviously still on your journey, but you've already come a long way since you started Times to Spare. And I think one pattern I've seen when I've interviewed entrepreneurs, even impact entrepreneurs, let alone startup founders in general, they try to stay away from governments and charities in the early days of starting their companies, because it means usually long sales cycles, long decision-making cycles, sometimes actually quite limited budgets, and it's all the things that scares a founder. So obviously you've embraced both these segments. what have you cracked that others weren't able to crack, or what has been difficult about it, maybe as well? Let's start with that. How did you approach all that of going into two very difficult sectors, at least based on what most entrepreneurs would say?
No, and I don't think I'd disagree that either of them were difficult. I think the main one by far is just the amount of time it takes to make the initial decision. So the thing that we have been surprised over and over again by is we might email a charity saying we've got this tool, it works like this other charity that we know that is using it, and they recommended that we speak to you, and then we won't get a reply, and then 4 or 5 months later, without a follow-up, we'll just get an email out of the blue saying this sounds brilliant, we'd love to try it, when can we get signed up? And I don't think that happens in other industries where it's just because you've got that 3 or 4 month waiting period for while people are going through their inboxes. There's a lot of people at charities who work part-time. They don't work 5 days a week. There's a lot of charities who don't make big decisions without running it past their board of trustees, because that's how the governance of charities works, and that might only meet every 3 months. So if you get involved at the wrong part of that cycle, you're not going to hear a yes or a no for 3 months' time, which is kind of frustrating if you're trying to move as quickly as possible. I think, and government is exactly the same. There's a tender process for some things. There's just like from first meeting organisation in the government, the process of getting budget, taking it to cabinet with writing up proposals to take to cabinet, sort of the local equivalent of the national cabinet. It all takes time. All takes multiple months for every new sale, I suppose. I think what we have found, which is pretty interesting, and probably what a lot of people would expect, is that with government, there's kind of a very long process to get trusted the first time round. But there is definitely the case that once you are in the door and you've crossed that threshold in terms of all of the regulatory requirements, but also just evidence that you know how to work with public sector, it's a lot quicker from then on. So we've had situations where the first time took 6 months, and then the add-on piece of work took a week or less, which is really good from that perspective.
There's mostly also more loyalty than once they're actually working with you. They tend to stick around a bit longer than maybe a private company that will constantly shop around or change, or I think there may be a bit more loyalty as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I hope. I guess we'll have to wait and see whether that's definitely true. The cool thing about what we're doing is we can sort of start working with the charities in an area first, while the local government is still making up their mind. So we can get going. We don't have to wait for the green light within the council to get going working with the local charities, which speeds up things a little bit.
Got it. And once you have those charity on board, the government can kind of tap into that straight away, pretty much. That's great. Yeah, amazing. What I'd love to know next, I think, on that topic is, what has been the biggest driver for you to go through this difficulty, right? I think whatever startup you're starting, it's going to be difficult, right? There's going to be something really tricky about it, because otherwise plenty of other people would have done it and succeeded in it, right? You're in an area that seems to be perceived as even more difficult than a lot of other areas. Has it been just your focus on the mission to really, I really want to see this work, and there's a real problem that kind of has pushed you through this difficulty, or has it been something different? How did you actually push through it? I'd be keen to know that.
I think the main sort of source of motivation really is a lot of the organisations, especially the charities that we work with, are like really quite underserved by like software tools in general. So yeah, if you go and work in advertising tech, you'll have 150 like competing tech products. They're all vaguely similar. But in the charity sector, like often, we'll do something and it's probably like the only example of that particular product or that particular feature that charities can actually use, which is pretty cool. And the sort of result of that is that we go into a charity and show them the system we've got, and like we get extremely positive feedback from people very quickly, and the work they're doing is it's really cool. Like it's you go to a local community centre and the sort of activities they're putting on for people, the support they're providing to people who just like have no other way of getting that support is really inspiring, and just being around that and being able to help out with that in some way is extremely motivating. And whenever it feels like a bit of a slog, it's just kind of like we just go over to one of the community centres and chat to them, and it's like extremely it turns that around very quickly, basically.
And was it always clear to you that there's going to be a sustainable commercial model around this as well? Or is this something that you had to figure out over time, or you even considered did you consider running it as a non-profit model as well? Or, I'd be keen to understand how you actually arrived at your current model.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sustainable business model and the sort of the scalable business model is something that we're always slightly working on and iterating on. It's kind of been our belief that once this information about charities exists in an easily understandable way, there will be ways that we can convert that into a much more scalable business model, and we're finding sort of small parts of that as we go. We considered setting it up as a non-profit. We wrote like a big blog post about why we didn't. I think mostly just kind of the fact that we don't quite know where we're going all the time is quite tricky for a non-profit with that sort of 3-month board of trustees governance structure and the having to write your purposes to the charity commission, and also knowing that everyone takes a long time to make decisions. We probably needed to raise some capital initially and throughout the journey, which you obviously can't do very easily as a non-profit. So those are the sort of two main considerations. But yeah, I think we've definitely shown that there is a sustainable business model in what we're doing, but finding like things to build on top of that is always what we're working on, basically.
And is there other actors trying to push into that space and creating solutions? I've also seen a blog post you wrote on big tech won't solve government's problems. Is there any solutions coming from those, or big tech won't solve the voluntary sector? I think you wrote. Is there other solutions being created? Is there a lot of competition, or does it seem like a lot of companies are trying to stay away from it?
So I think, the big tech won't save the voluntary sector was because like one of the former, I think he was on the Monetary Policy Committee for the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, was talking about how there's not enough tech infrastructure for the voluntary sector, especially around volunteering, which I think became really, really apparent with the volunteering over the pandemic. And he was suggesting that maybe Google or Facebook or Amazon or something should step in to build a volunteer platform for the whole country, and they should do it as a CSR project, essentially. They haven't done that, and I don't think they will do that, and I don't think we really want them to. They haven't stepped in. There are sort of other organisations and other companies, other charities even, working on similar things to what we're doing. I think especially if you sort of break up what we're doing into some of the constituent parts, there are people who are doing like individual pieces of that fairly well. I think some of them are quite old, so they've been around for 20 years, and it does kind of tell. But yeah, I don't think it's completely ignored, but it definitely doesn't have quite as much attention as it should get for what is quite a big part of government spending and the economy as a whole, essentially.
Got it. And then for founders that are in your position, let's imagine somebody that's currently at Oliver Wyman and is thinking about selling to government, or they are seeing a solution that government may be benefiting from, or they see a solution that charities could benefit from. What would your biggest advice be for the early days of, making that happen and bringing a startup off the ground that sells to government or charities or has to partner with them? It depends on those sales cycles.
Yeah, so I think if you are trying to sell to government and you don't have sort of those pre-existing connections to people who work in government already, I think really the only way you can do it, or at least the way we managed to do it, was to do something on the cheap. So we signed like this extremely small but very flexible contract with a council in London, where they gave us a small amount of money and told us just to go and do something that the local charity sector would find useful. And so two of us basically worked full time for 12 months addressing that problem, and came back with something which was useful by that point, and the council had got it for not much money, so they were extremely happy with us, which was really helpful, because I think especially within government there's this big desire to buy sort of the proven, tested version of a system, and so if you try and sell something for quite a lot of money to people you don't know, that no one else has tested or used, I don't think you'll have much success. But now when we're talking to people, we can say, we've got this system, we built it, we've tested it in this area, and it does work to solve some of these problems. So it's a much easier conversation to have, basically.
Yeah. And do you feel like reference clients, obviously it will always make sense for most startups to have a reference customer and trials and things like that. But do you feel like it works well for local governments as well, where you go from council to council and say, hey, your neighboring council is already using us. How about you? Is that working really well for you?
Yeah, I mean, we do exactly that. We have exactly that conversation with people. I have like a map on Figma of all of the London boroughs of where we do work and don't, and sort of trying to colour them in all green. So we do have the conversations where we say, the council just over the border that you are sort of semi-competing with are using the system and it's going well. Do you want to try it out? So that sort of works like informally, but I don't know if people don't know much about government procurement. There's like a lot of different ways that governments can buy things, and one of them is sort of like on an open tender, where they sort of announce to the world that they're about to pay for something, and then those have like explicit explicit evaluation frameworks attached to them. So there'll be a certain percentage of it will be judged based on price, a certain percentage of it will be judged on like quality. And often the quality score, at least some part of that, will just be, have you done this kind of project with other parts of government? So if you don't have something to put in that box, you'll get 0 marks on that score. And if sometimes there's a hard limit where if you don't have an example of that, you're just simply not considered for that project. So I think there's sometimes like very formal reasons why it's extremely helpful in selling to government.
Amazing. And throughout the time that you've run Time to Spare now, I think you've been running it for more than 2 years, almost 3 years now. What's been the hardest challenge you had to resolve, or the hardest, most difficult part you had to learn?
I think it was probably the experience at the start of the pandemic, when up to then we'd been working with charities, helping them sort of record information about their events in person. And a lot of the events were for like older people, so it was sort of drop-in centres for older people, which for like extremely obvious reasons had to completely shut down during the pandemic, and have really only opened up in the past 2 months or so. And so we had to basically completely change what we were doing as a business for that year, and basically build 2 new products on top of what we had already within those 6 months, to sort of keep the business afloat, because there was just not anyone who was going to use or be interested in what we had up to that point, which was a big challenge. Lots of sort of long days, and late nights, but pretty satisfying because we did actually manage to keep growing despite that, which was pretty good, we thought. So that was cool.
Yeah, and you already mentioned how you were able to help councils during the pandemic as well, but I think it's probably just one of the examples of businesses pivoting and changing their models faced with the pandemic, which is great to hear. My last question for you would be, if you imagine the world in 10 years, maybe the world of charities and council, corporation, or government in a broader sense, how does the world look like in 10 years if Time to Spare succeeds in your mission?
So I think the big change would be that the way that councils decide to spend money is more determined by the sort of communities and people in their area, and not just councils, but also sort of like central government. So at the moment, like often a council will make a decision and then they'll find out who to give that money to off the back of that. And what would be really cool is if instead it is people saying, it's more easily to say, like, these are the people that need support, these are the support that is needed, and we therefore think that you should fund that in some way. And sort of the impetus and the drive for like some of that funding and that commissioning is coming more bottom up rather than sort of driven top down from like central government, basically.
Amazing. Tom, thanks very much for sharing your journey with us, explaining what you're already doing with councils and charities alike at the moment, and really love your vision for the future. So thanks so much for taking the time, and all the best for the future.
Thanks.